Economic and social differences between the North and the South. Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793 made cotton become very profitable. The increase in the number of plantations willing to move from other crops to cotton meant a need for cheap labor in the form of slaves. Southern economy became a one-crop economy, depending on cotton and therefore on slaves. Northern economy was based more on industry than agriculture. They were purchasing raw cotton and turning it into finished goods. This disparity between the two set up major differences in economic attitudes.
States versus federal rights. Since the Revolution, two groups emerged, those arguing for greater rights and those arguing that the government needed to have more control. Many felt that the United States Constitution ignored the rights of states to continue to act independently. They felt that the states should have the right to rule federal acts unconstitutional. This resulted in the idea of nullification. When nullification would not work and states felt that they were no longer respected, they moved towards secession.
Fight between slave and non-slave proponents. With land gained from the Louisiana Purchase and later with the Mexican War, the question of whether new states admitted to the Union would be slave or free. The Missouri Compromise, passed in 1820, made a rule that prohibited slavery in states from the former Louisiana Purchase. Also, David Wilmot proposed the Wilmot Proviso in 1846, which would ban slavery in the new lands, but was shot down after much debate. The Compromise of 1850 was created by Henry Clay and others to deal with the balance between slave and free states. One of the provisions included the Fugitive Slave Act, which lit the fire of the Underground Railroad. Another issue that increased tensions was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It created two new territories that would allow states to use popular sovereignty to determine whether they would be free or slave.
Growth of the abolition movement. Northerners became polarized against slavery, and sympathies began to grow for abolitionists and slaves. The publishing of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Dred Scott Case, John Brown's Raid, and the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act all added to the abolitionist movement.
The election of Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln was elected in 1860, South Carolina issued its Declaration of the Causes of Secession. They believed Lincoln was anti-slavery and in favor of Northern interests. Before Lincoln was president, 7 states had seceded from the Union: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas.
The top events leading to the Civil War.
With the Mexican War ended, the new land gained brought more controversy over free or slave states.
The Fugitive Slave Law caused great controversy among Northern abolitionists. Uncle Tom's Cabin made Northerners aware of the plight of the Southern slave.
Under the doctrine of popular sovereignty, anti-slavery immigrants from the North clashed with armed pro-slavery groups from Missouri.
President Brooks, a slavery advocate, attacked Charles Sumner, an abolitionist, over an anti-slavery speech.
The Dred Scott Case increased tensions between the North and the South in terms of slavery ownership and freedom.
This document permitted slavery, excluded free blacks from living in Kansas, and allowed only male citizens of the United States to vote.
Activist John Brown led a rebellion against Southern plantation owners and took over Harper's Ferry.
The election of Abraham Lincoln was the last straw in keeping the United States together. After this, Southerners seceded from the Union.
South Carolina led the long chain of secessions from the Union.
The Battle of Fort Sumter was the bombardment and surrender of Fort Sumter in South Carolina that started the American Civil War.
At first, the Union Army seemed on the verge of victory, pushing back Beauregard's forces, while the Southern Brigade, led by General Stonewall Jackson, desperately tried to hold their high ground at Henry Hill.
The tide shifted when Joseph Johnston stood up with his army and counterattacked, pushing the Union Army back to Washington.
This battle showed Lincoln that McClellan is unable to man an army, and on the other side, gave Robert E. Lee a chance to lead the Army of Northern Virginia.
The Southern leaders, I think, were stronger than the Northern leaders. I think many people would agree with that for a couple reasons. One, they were raised on horseback a lot earlier than a typical young boy in the North. They were given guns to fire earlier on than many of the young men in the North. And it was really a prized part of their culture as a young man to be very good on horseback, very good in the wilderness survival. They were farm boys. They were used to traveling distances to towns or to other plantations or other farms. And also, I think if you look at the track record, most of the top West Point grads were from the South. I think that when the war started, that became very evident. If you look at the first 3 years of the war, even if you ask a common person today, name the generals of the Civil War, most of the people that they will identify are of Confederate uniforms. And a lot of it being is that they were able to pull off a victory even though they were outnumbered sometimes 3 or 4 to 1, just because they were a little more comfortable with warfare and the mechanisms and materials needed for warfare. But on the flip side, by the time we get to 64 and 65, many of the Union men have made that adjustment. They're getting better and better on horseback. You see that in 63 at the Battle of Brandy Station before Gettysburg, where for the first time a major cavalry battle would be decided where the United States would win and not the Confederate cavalry that we saw so often in the first 2.5 years of the war. So it's kind of a connection a little bit to just we had to get our war machine running, just like we had to in World War II. And once that war machine was running, just the sheer numbers and experience of the Union troops would be very positive for them in their victories.
The Battle of Bull Run was influential in the fact that it brought McClellan back to leadership in the North and almost brought the British on the side of the South.
The Battle of Antietam was the single bloodiest one-day battle in the Civil War. It also managed to keep the British out of the Civil War.
McClellan was able to get Robert E. Lee to retreat out of the North.
Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. The Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. By the President of the United States of America. A proclamation. Whereas, on the 22nd day of September in the year of our Lord 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States, containing among other things the following, to wit, that on the 1st day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward and forever free, and the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons.
event do I believe is the turning point of the war? This may be a disagreement with other people that study the Civil War extensively. Many people look at Gettysburg as being the turning point of the war. I look at it as a combination of basically 2 or 3 events. One is the loss of the Confederates at Gettysburg and the day after at Vicksburg. It was a Western campaign at Vicksburg. It was the heartland in the Mississippi River for the Confederates, and it really started to cause a great impact on their supplies, their food, their farmers, their ability to move troops, because the main highway cutting through the South was taken over by the Union flotillas. The other turning point, I believe, was Grant being named as the commander of the Army, because at this point it gave a different aspect of fighting. Grant turned and was able to coordinate numerous armies to fight simultaneously across the South, and including Grant working with Meade to continually attack Lee until Lee was running out of men and supplies and was just physically exhausted. So that would be the Overland Campaign, which is over the spring of '64. I think once Petersburg siege occurred, it was only a matter of time. I think Robert E. Lee would agree with that too if we would interview him today. It was only a matter of time until the Confederates would fall.
Could you please evaluate the relationship between Lincoln and McClellan?
Yes, at first it started off very, very well. Abraham Lincoln had a lot of respect for George McClellan because of his military record, his fighting in foreign wars prior to, his observation of the Crimean War, and his accolades coming out of West Point. He felt he needed him after the First Manassas battle and called upon George McClellan immediately. McClellan did an awesome job as far as training the men and preparing them for battle, but where it started to get a little awkward was during the late fall and into the winter months of 1861 and 62, where McClellan was being very non-committal on what he was going to do with his men, and finally he gave his Peninsula Campaign, which still did not make Lincoln feel totally confident, fearing that he may expose the nation's capital when McClellan would move his large army out of D.C. Compromise was given. McClellan was given the go-ahead by Abraham Lincoln, but many people started turning also against McClellan as far as the non-military people, because they just looked at George McClellan as being an arrogant person. But when it boils down to it, McClellan did a great job of building an army that would be needed for the Civil War.
Sherman and his army marched across Georgia to defeat the rebellion still fighting. Lee was scrambling back to try to meet up with Johnston before Grant could get to him, but Grant eventually cut his army off.
What was the main difference between Grant and the other failing commanders?
Yeah, I kind of already alluded to that a little bit. Grant's idea of fighting was to keep your enemy on their toes. He realized that we had the industrial power on the northern side. We had more men, we had more railroads, we had more ships. And the Confederates, I think he understood the idea that they are fighting, in some respects, similar to George Washington. Hit and run. They only have X amount of men. They only have so much material. And it would be a war of attrition. We would see it again, I believe, with Japan in World War II, where they just ran out of material, they ran out of men, they ran out of an air force. And I think Grant saw that, and he realized that although it may be very costly at the outset, that if we fight in numerous fronts, the Confederates just don't have the ability to defend their land.